You know, when in the early days of post-colonial theory as we know it, there was a great deal of, say, 80s, 90s, there was a lot of confusion about what post-colonial theory really was and what its relation to anti-colonial struggles was, and so what was the theory? Was it something that was being put together by Western intellectuals who were getting their inspiration from post-structuralism, or did it really belong to the scene of post-colonial struggles, and was Fanon post-colonial, or was Homi Bhabha post-colonial? And by now there's this sense that it's everything. Which is very interesting because it takes away the expertise from it. It sort of suggests that it's a network of things. There are many words for this, from critical theory. Words like assemblage, like network, dispositif. But the one I like, which does a similar sort of work, is the word jugaad. And it's become very popular. And what it refers to is, it's a term for just something makeshift, So say, if you use the pump from a water pump and use it to produce a motor for a makeshift vehicle that has to transport fish. So it's just something put together out of different parts to serve a purpose. And I like that word. Not that I have any objection to European words, but it explains the makeshift nature of post-colonial theory, so that it's not a dogma, and its willingness to harness meaning from anywhere. And across a variety of sites. So that's why what jugaad does to explain how post-colonial theory works. So it's not a grand philosophy, it's makeshift, and it's made up of all kinds of different incongruent parts. The short answer is no. It is actually very attached to being non-teleological, so it doesn't have a purpose, but it does have a context. It's a form of critical theory, and its critique is unlike other forms of critical theory. It is very firmly tethered to the problem of imperialism. And it sees itself, or it is, a meditation on that problem. That meditation has many disciplinary registers. So it can be a political meditation, or an economic meditation, or a philosophical one, or indeed an ethical meditation. I would say, actually referring to my talk, that there are three that help for the purposes of taxonomy. There may be many others that we can include, but these three seem to me comprehensive. One is, it involves, though it's a critique very often of Western imperialism, it includes very much Western self-critique. It takes its cue at various historical moments from projects of Western anti-imperialism. That's one part. There have been European critiques of empire for as long as there has been empire. So that history of internal critiques of imperialism is one element. And the second element is everything that comes under anti-colonial liberation movements, which may or may not end in nationalism. I think it's very important to point that out, because anti-colonial liberation movements are sometimes internationalist. Take the Pan-African Congress. take the Bandung Conference, and they very often don't end in nationalisms. So many civil rights movements of the 20th century were distinctly anti-imperial movements for race equality, primarily. But they did not end in nationalism. So it's a misconception that post-colonial liberation movements always end in nationalism. So anti-colonial liberation movements, which may or may not end in nationalism, which are sometimes critical of nationalism as well. And then the third, which has started to come into view more with the environmental turn, is something that Gayatri Spivak and now many others call planetarity. The third element of the post-colonial jugaad is planetary movements, which are, say, movements against global impoverishment, on behalf of fragile ecosystems, on behalf of non-human life. I always like to include pacifism in this series because pacifism is planetary. It wants peace in the world. So I want to use modern in a very specific way because people are always saying, well, what's the imperial power now? But what I want to say is actually one of the very interesting things that have happened in the last 2 decades is there's been a tremendous interest in empire studies, and there's been a lot of attention to antique empires it's been very productive, even to thinking about imperialism as a structure and a system. Even, Nkrumah, in his work on anti-colonialism, begins with Alexander as the imperialist, and he says that, when Alexander had nothing else to conquer, he sat down and cried. So there are many histories of imperialism. But it is certainly the case that predominantly post-colonialism has been preoccupied with the sort of imperialism that was produced by modernity, or in the time of so-called modernity or enlightenment. And this is quite important because the argument is that the whole thing about modernity is that in Europe, that it inaugurated a certain investment in democracy, in republicanism, in freedom from external tyranny, in anti-absolutism. So the question is, how did empire happen at the same time? How is it that you had a system of such pride in egalitarianism and managed to suspend that investment in egalitarianism in the colonial project? So this question of this double time in modernity, which is exemplified by empire, but not just by empire. I mean, slavery is an instance of this double time, and I think that's a very good place to a very important starting point for post-colonial analysis, this question of the contradiction in modernity, and how it travels, how it becomes ingrained in modernity, that you are willing or able to claim freedom and the right to freedom and the right to subjugate others at the same time. So there's a great interest in how this travels, beyond the encounter between Europe and non-Europe, how it travels into the history of modern governance itself, and that is something we have to be aware of. So I suppose that's what I mean by modern imperialism, as a particular form of power that involves a temporal contradiction and a moral contradiction. The idea, I'm very taken with 2 terms in your question. One is ethics and the other is departure. Ethics, because, and we can talk about this later, because it's a very important component of postcolonial theory. That it involves, again, when people think about it, they assume that it means movements for national liberation. But the history of anti-imperialism has very much involved this project of the transformation of the self. So ethics is important. Ethics covers that. And we are helped enormously by the ethical turn in critical theory. Departure, well, by departure, I think what postcolonialism at its best is interested in, and this is really very important, is in escaping the logic of oppression. And what does it mean to escape the logic of oppression? Is that you never fall into the temptation of becoming the oppressor. And that is always the anxiety, you know, in pacifist thinking. The anxiety is if you use violence, then you will become the oppressor. So that you must always resist the temptation to succumb to the logic of oppression. So departure or exit is one way of refusing that logic of oppression, you know. And refusing to be oppressed, but refusing to become an oppressor. And I think that's what the term departure covers. Now, exit is a very loaded term in Western philosophy, of course, because, you know, Kant's famous essay on Aufklärung and on how important we attain enlightenment when we find the way out from our immaturity. You know, Foucault takes this up, this idea of exit. In fact, Foucault's preoccupied with this idea of exit. So when I say postcolonialism is an ethics of departure, I want to place it in that genealogy as a body of philosophy that takes exit very seriously. And there are many forms of exit or exiting oppression or exiting the ground of oppression that pertain to postcolonial analysis. Disobedience is one, you know, disobeying your government. Marronage, runaway slaves. That history as a form of protest. I will not be injured, I will not become an injurer, I will run away, is a very important conceit. So I suppose that's what I mean by an ethics of departure. By claiming a new ground, by starting something new. Well, you see, I really think that one way to describe postcolonialism, one way to make sense of what I'm calling its ethics of departure, is to think of it as a modern philosophy of renunciation. And there are many global philosophical sources for philosophy of renunciation. And renunciation we can talk about in a bit. It's a wonderful, complex idea. It does not mean being in contemptus mundi, you know, it is not about contempt of the world, a hatred of the world. It's about running away from the way in which you know yourself, the ways in which you are stuck, to the way in which you are spiritually endangered sometimes. But also so that you leave the attachments that have been given to you, professional, inherited ties, in order to form attachments with the world, to become an altruistic person. So that's what renunciation means. Now, one philosophy of renunciation that falls into the scene of postcolonialism is Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism was at the apex of renunciatory movements in South Asia. And there may have been a lot of crisscross between these movements in South Asia and the birth of modern cynicism, of ancient cynicism, because there was contact between these cultures. But Buddhism was at the apex. And Buddhism is rediscovered by B.R. Ambedkar, who was an untouchable and a Dalit, but also one of the founders of the Indian Constitution. And his conversion to Buddhism was really a demand that those who are oppressed take on a sort of Buddhist renunciation. It's a wonderful idea that it is those who suffer the most who are capable of renunciation. You know, we only think that the wealthy and the privileged can be renouncers. But this is a radical idea. What does it mean? It means renouncing, getting away from the way in which you are being injured, but also to a place where you can offer refuge to others. And that's the kind of Buddhism that Ambedkar revived in 1956. 1922, Hermann Hesse, who is sick at heart with German militarism and a pacifist, and I love pacifists, writes Siddhartha, so this revival of Buddhist renunciation, and he urges, and just before he writes Siddhartha, he writes what is it called? The Return of Zarathustra. He's ventriloquizing Nietzsche, and he's telling German youth to leave, to get outside of, to exit, to depart from militarism and nationalism. And then these ideas, already he's turning to the East as Nietzsche did with Zarathustra, but then he turns to the Buddha story in Siddhartha. And it is a happy coincidence that this philosophy of renunciation becomes available at the time of 20th century imperialism and totalitarianism. Of course, Jaspers is also interested in Buddhism for the very same reason at this time. So there is something to be said about the availability of these ideas, of Buddhism as a form of renunciation. And there are other forms of renunciation. Really, cynicism is another form of renunciation that postcolonialism can draw on. But I think there's something to be discovered in the Buddhist idea. And anarchism is exactly the same sort of ethics of departure, the same sort of modern philosophy of renunciation, because and anarchism is wonderful on renunciation, and because the idea isn't about penury and hardship and self-flagellation. It is about how, if you exit in the right way, you discover the superabundance of things, that there's enough for everybody. So it's that kind of idea of renunciation that, yes, is there in anarchism, another very important source for anti-imperial thought. There's many anarchists were anti-imperial. Western anti-imperialists were very anarchist in the late 19th century, and Gandhi learned a lot from Western anarchist traditions. So. There's so many things to say about this, but I mean, let me introduce a word that I didn't use in my lecture. I'm very drawn to the term minor when I'm describing postcolonial theory, and minor means not seeking to become canonical, remaining small, and in a sense confounding the status quo by refusing to aspire to it. And it's also a term from music, and the minor key is very interesting. It's discordant, it's troubling. It's like, as Socrates says, I want to be a gadfly to the state. So the minor key is like that. It introduces a discordance. But what sort of discordance is it? That in fact, you know, it's often said that when you hear a minor key, it's discordant because you hear too many notes, too many keys. There's not one pure, clear sound. And I think in that way, a minor key includes everything. It's inclusive, and the discordance comes from that. So I without adding this up, I would say that if you said, do the resources of postcolonial theory point to a way of life? My answer is yes. And how can we describe that way of life? I would say living in a minor key.